This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence report on the cost of compliance, which looks at the challenges financial services firms expect to face in the year ahead. I'm Stacey English, Head of Regulatory Intelligence, and I'm joined by our senior expert and co-author, Susannah Hammond. Almost 900 firms from around the world took part in the research this year, which provides really credible insight. And I must thank the thousands of senior compliance practitioners who so openly shared their views with us over the last 10 years. The findings help firms with planning, and the real value for compliance is being able to benchmark their own approach, resources and expectations against peers to determine whether they are in line with the wider industry. When Susannah and I started the research just after the financial crisis, both the industry and the role of compliance were very different to where we are now. We were also entering a decade of massive regulatory change. So the report has evolved in parallel with the changes to financial services and the role of compliance.
And that role of compliance has developed out of all recognition in the last 10 years to the business prevention unit, the policeman, the no-men, whatever that the epithet was back then. Now compliance is a fundamental part of the business process, and you have to invest and understand and work with your risk and compliance functions if you want success into even the short and medium term. But one of the things that we've certainly seen develop over the last 10 years is how much people have been willing to share with us as part of their response. We see now in the free text questions we ask an almost cathartic outpouring of the challenges and the issues. So to echo Stacey, thank you so much for all of that information, and we try and wrap that up and feed it back to people so they can then use it for benchmarking or whatever. So in those 10 years, or over those 10 years, what has been the biggest trend, do you think?
Well, I think over the last decade we've seen significant change in the compliance function itself. Specifically, I think we can see compliance has now a much greater role in the business itself. It's taken much more seriously, and the sorts of challenges we'd hear about where compliance couldn't get senior management time or couldn't get budget are largely confined to the past. And I think that's driven, as a result of a lot of the enforcement actions we've seen over the last decade. How important compliance is to the firm. We've also witnessed the impact of technology, and that's had a real change on the role of compliance. It's impacting how activities are undertaken, but also the remit is having to expand to allow for the risks that are brought about by new technology, and specifically things like data security issues or cyber attacks, which can actually have an adverse impact on customers. We've seen some things stay constant. So the volume and pace of regulatory change, that's been singled out year on year as the biggest single challenge. And that's really something we've seen at Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence, where we're now tracking over 1,000 regulators, 220 alerts every single day, which is an awful lot of information for firms to keep on top of.
Exactly.
And finally, in terms of personal liability, there's been a sort of steady rise in compliance, expecting to have greater personal liability. And what that means is actually it's getting harder to fill some of those senior roles with qualified and experienced staff.
Yes, exactly. And what we're seeing now for this year, those 900 respondents that you mentioned earlier, is the focus again on regulatory change and the sheer regulatory burden associated with always changing. I mean, if your entire IT budget is basically absorbed by having to implement regulatory change, that leaves precious little else around the edges for business development, sorting out your IT infrastructure, whatever it happens to be. So there is definitely a burden there. Also this year, people have been telling us that there is a big focus on financial crime in the biggest sense. So prevention of money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, sanctions, all of that is a really big focus. And then last but definitely not least is culture and conduct risk. I mean, so what that is talking about things that aren't in the black and white of the rule book, but are such a central regulatory focus, regulatory expectation. You can hardly read a speech from a regulator without culture or how a business is operating coming up in that. So given all of the changes we've seen in the last 10 years, uniquely this year we asked the question, what do you see as the biggest change in the coming 10 years? So where did we get to with the biggest change for the next 10 years?
Well, obviously we asked an open question about this, and we had a lot of deep responses, and there was a lot of consensus that actually it's technology that's going to be the biggest change in the next decade. And the overriding expectation is that technology is going to mean that a lot of compliance activities are actually automated. On the back of that, that changes the role and the skills that are required in compliance. And we're expecting to see that practitioners are going to need to be experts in things like regtech, fintech, data analytics, so that they can actually advise their business. So as well as being experts on the regulations, they're going to need to have that wider skill set that brings in the technology angle. We're also hearing that compliance officers are expecting to have a much greater role in the business. So they're expecting to be consulted early on, so they're involved in planning and strategy right through to product development and delivery, rather than, as has happened in the past, just being brought in when things go wrong. So a lot of change going on, a lot of challenges that we're hearing about. What do you think one thing compliance should be focused on?
For me, it would be their skill sets. They are not, senior compliance people in particular, are not going to be able to deal with the future without making sure their skill sets are completely up to date. I mean, we've touched on the need for the automation and the technology. So as a senior compliance officer, are you able to assess a fintech product? Do you know what regtech is? Do you know how it could impact your firm? Equally, the more interesting, shall we say, products, Bitcoin, distributed ledger technology, blockchain. Do you know how those work? Do you know how they could impact your business? So my one piece of advice is skill sets. Invest in your skill sets. Invest in the skill sets for your team. Just invest in your skills, and that, I think, will equip you the very best it possibly can to take you into the future.
Very sound advice. And in terms of the report itself?
Please download it from Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence, and we'll have the link out to everyone as soon as possible.
Thank you, Susannah.